So data democratization to me means having access to not just the data at any of those stages, but also the processes that operate on the data so that I can leverage the work that's been done by other teams and not recreate that work myself.
Welcome to This is Digital, a podcast brought to you by West Monroe. Join us as we talk to leading experts about bringing the digital mindset to your organization.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to This is Digital, a podcast where we break down the latest digital trends and share tips on how you and your company can be digital. I'm your host, Rissa Redden, partner and chief marketing officer at West Monroe. At West Monroe, we help businesses be digital. But what does that mean? How do you define digital? At its core, digital is a connected mindset and way of working across all aspects of your business. However, our team knows that digital can be interpreted in so many ways. That's why, as you listen to This is Digital, you hear different definitions of what digital means to us and to our guests. Today, I'm excited to introduce Chris D'Agostino, Global Field CTO at Databricks, and West Monroe's own Doug Laney, Innovation Fellow. Chris and Doug join us to talk about everything data and how companies can use data to not only give them a competitive advantage, but also improve the company from within. We're also going to dive into the idea or concept of the democratization of data, and we're going to talk about what it means to build an efficient data tech stack. Chris and Doug, thank you so much for joining. I would love for each of you to talk a little bit about your background that brings us to this moment. And Chris, I wonder if I could start with you.
Thanks, Rissa. Good to be with you and Doug. So I joined Databricks about 4 years ago as the Global Field CTO for the company. And prior to that, I'll get into my Databricks experience as we go through the podcast today. But prior to that, I was at Capital One for 5 years, where ultimately I was running the data engineering function for our data transformation initiative and gained a lot of experience moving from on-prem systems, data systems into the cloud, and then how do you re-platform those data systems. And then prior to that, I had my own software company for nearly 13 years that was doing work for the U.S. intelligence community and building data solutions in that space.
And if I have my facts straight, Chris, your team at Capital One was 1,000 people?
Yes, I was part of a 1,000-person group that was responsible for doing the data transformation on the data engineering side. What ended up happening, ultimately, I kind of went through some progressive increases in responsibility, and so was ultimately managing the entire team.
Doug Laney, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Rissa. Great to be with you again. Chris, thanks for joining us. I'm an innovation fellow with West Monroe's data engineering and analytics practice, where I mostly work with clients on developing their data and analytics strategy and operating models. I specialize in helping businesses conceive and implement new and innovative ways to monetize and value their data as an actual enterprise asset. The bulk of my career I spent as a senior research analyst with Gartner's Chief Data Officer Research and Advisory Group, where I published my first book, Infonomics, How to Monetize, Manage, and Measure Information as an Asset for Competitive Advantage. And earlier in my career, I spent a few years in the AI field and with one of the pioneering data warehouse solution providers. Currently, I'm involved in some other things. I also teach an MBA course at University of Illinois, and I'm one of Carnegie Mellon University's Chief Data Officer Certificate Program faculty. I also am a co-chair of the MIT Chief Data Officer Symposium, and I publish in Forbes and Chief Data Officer magazine. And in addition to my Infonomics book, my new book, Data Juice, 101 Stories of How Organizations Are Squeezing Value from Available Data Assets, is now available. I live in Chicago and a few blocks here from Wrigley Field. And of course, yes, I'm a huge Cubs fan.
Chris and Doug, you both talk to data leaders all of the time. And I'm curious what themes you see emerging in these conversations. What's really top of mind for data leaders, and what are the problems that they are very focused on solving right now? Let's start with you, Chris.
So in my experience in talking to these leaders globally, it generally falls into two broad categories. The first is if the organization is predominantly on-prem and trying to transition to the cloud, the question becomes, what is the sort of path to get there? How do they ensure that the data is protected in the cloud? It's particularly important for regulated businesses with PII information and some of the security controls around that. The second group is, and sometimes these happen simultaneously, but the second group is many of the organizations are already in the cloud and they're trying to understand what do they need to do differently from the traditional ways of processing data that they were used to in the past. What do they need to do differently moving forward? And the majority of organizations, large enterprises, that is, are multi-cloud already. And so when it comes to the data estate, it becomes very important for them to disambiguate, well, am I going to choose a vendor solution to work with data or a series of vendor solutions? Am I going to go with cloud native services? And what are the pros and cons of that?
And Doug, are you hearing something similar? What are you hearing when you talk to data leaders?
Yeah, certainly on the tech side, I think fully leveraging and integrating technologies continues to be a significant challenge, such as integrating analytic output directly into operational systems and strategic processes. I was just meeting with a client yesterday, mostly a manufacturing company that has some retail as well. And they have some great dashboards, but they're really not integrating yet that analytic output really into their processes and systems, maybe some of their manual processes. I also think that keeping up with advances in data management, analytics, and AI is particularly challenging right now. But I think some of the bigger challenges are a bit softer. They relate more to data literacy and organizational change. What data do we have? How can we use it? What is the art of the possible? How can we position our organizations or reconfigure our organization to get people on the same page when it comes to how we're going to become data-driven? I also think innovation is a challenge. Too many organizations are stuck doing hindsight-oriented reporting and creating dashboards and really not thinking about or planning how to use data to diagnose, predict, or prescribe or automate things. And something that I really like to see that I think is a bit advanced and a challenge for many organizations is transitioning the data and analytics program from that of a cost center to one of a real self-funding program. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Are you interested in AI but not sure how to apply it to your business? You are in luck. Our AI experts at West Monroe are launching a new video podcast called This is AI. It won't be like anything else you've seen or heard. Instead of just talking about AI, our experts will show you real examples of how to apply AI to your business. It will launch September 30th, and you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube. And Doug, you raised a whole host of topics. How do you help chief data officers think through the right order in which to tackle some of these challenges?
Yeah, we have a maturity model that we use that starts with culture and leadership and strategy and goes through and looks at architecture and metrics and governance and how well data is being deployed and, of course, the tech stack as well. And what we try to do is kind of achieve a balance. Many organizations tend to get really out in front, like our strategy is way more advanced than our technology capabilities, or vice versa. Our technology is really significant, but we haven't positioned ourselves organizationally or architecturally to be able to take advantage of it. So dealing with all of those dimensions in step is really important.
And Chris, when you were just talking about the shift from moving from on-prem to cloud or being in a multi-cloud environment, I'm curious about some of the challenges that organizations face, meaning I take from what you have said that you need to do things differently versus just taking what you had before and just, moving the furniture from one home to another, if you will, that you really need to approach it differently. Is that accurate? And if so, how do you like to advise your clients?
Yeah, so as Doug mentioned, he elaborated on a bunch of other key components of this. We think about, generally speaking, you talk about people, process, and technology. We talk about it at Databricks as people, process, and the platform.
Well, don't forget about data, Chris.
Well, the data sort of flows through all of this, of course. But the point is that organizations can put together a well-defined strategy. Where I see a lot of the friction occurring is, okay, how do we turn that strategy into reality? How do we actually get the data into the systems that need to generate the insights and need to enable people to do their jobs more efficiently and hopefully with better, more joy in their job? One of the key things that we measured at Capital One that I think was really innovative at the time, because this is going back to like 2016, was we did an NPS score for the internal associates at Capital One for how they use data. And we would measure how effective they felt they were and whether or not they enjoyed the way in which they were working with data inside the organization. And we found there was a lot of work to do to improve that. With the race for talent and how difficult it is to find the proper talent and the cost associated with that talent, and we can get into Gen AI and all the things that it might be able to help with, but that concept of the people are really important resources in an organization. The data is vital to the success of the organization. How do you make it so that the data is really accessible but secure And what do you need to do to ensure that the people enjoy their jobs as much as they possibly can when they're at work? To me, I keep coming back, and Databricks will keep coming back to it is about the platform. The platform can be a great enabler of that, and the tech stack itself can really make this easier or hard.
And with the comment that you made about, balancing accessibility with security, are they two poles, if you will? I mean, is it a spectrum across, or is there a different way to think about weighing the trade-offs between accessibility and security?
Yeah, so going back to sort of maybe completing the answer to your earlier question about is there a different way of approaching this? I like to think about form following function. In the past, you had these discrete systems that were purpose built for the types of workloads that they needed to perform. And I love making car analogies because I love cars. You see the rise in the last 15 years of platforms in the automobile industry where manufacturers in the past used to make these one-off versions of different cars, right? And they would design the sports car and the minivan and the SUV and the sedan. Now you're seeing these multi-purpose platforms that are being built. And so it allows these manufacturers to be much more agile, and they can respond to market demands more quickly because they can adjust what type of vehicle they're providing based on a common platform. So I think about it in sort of that context. Mm-hmm. The form following function, I think organizations do need to think about it differently, because when it comes to data security, it used to be, okay, let's put all the data that's needed for this particular set of functions in this one system, and we will just grant access to individual users to that system. And when you replicate that across many, many systems in an organization, and where I come from, there sometimes were near 1,000 production applications. So trying to grant access to 1,000 different systems to an individual is just a sort of a showstopper. The access control mechanism, though, is really important because you've got sensitive data. So really thinking about things differently is finding new ways to share data across an environment and hopefully leverage role-based access control as well as AI to figure out whether or not somebody should have access to things. And then more ephemeral compute environments where maybe data comes together for a very brief moment in time to figure out a computation or generate a response. And then the data, that environment dissolves and goes away.
I want to get your perspective on that, Doug, but that's interesting to me to think about data as more fluid versus an Excel spreadsheet or that's, I'm sure, a horrible analogy, but it's not fixed. It can be more fluid and more situational, maybe is a way to think about it, that you only need data for a certain amount of time or for a certain project. But then once it's no longer needed, then how does it disappear? But Doug Laney, what would you add?
Many of the more novel architectures, and I suppose they've been around for up to 20 years or so, do bring together data in a virtual fashion. Rather than dumping it all into a data warehouse or a data lake, we can now connect data sources and create a data mesh or a data fabric to access them as needed. And those models that are used to pull that data together may be, like Chris says, ephemeral and only single use. On the other hand, it may be a good idea to kind of keep them around in case someone else perhaps needs them down the line.
Next question. What are some of the biggest variances that you see across data leaders? I would think that there are perhaps differences based on industry or based on regulatory environments. But, what are you seeing as far as the differences from one data leader to the next? Chris, let's start with you.
Well, I think the thing that I've been most impressed with in talking to, prospects and existing customers is how much the data leader understands the core business that they're working in. And when you had tech organizations separate from the lines of business, you would have very savvy business people that understand what the business is trying to accomplish. And sometimes you would have, you'd have the very savvy technologists, but they don't really understand what the business is attempting to do. And so to them, they're building these systems and they don't really understand the purpose behind the system necessarily fully. And so the data leaders that we're talking to really have to bridge that gap and really have to understand both sides. It's fairly rare to find somebody, if you're scoring on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of strengths, it's fairly rare to find somebody that's got both a 10 in the business acumen side as well as a 10 in the technology side. And so it's where the partnership, I think, is really important when they choose the various partners that they're going to work with to build out their systems, finding partners that can help augment or close the gap on any of the tech missing pieces, for example.
Well, and Chris, with your comment about people might be a 10 out of 10 on technology or 10 out of 10 on the business, but not 10 out of 10 on both. Why is that? Is that the way that we are raising people up? Is that a mentoring topic or a training topic? How did we get to this place?
Well, I think the traditional roles in education, like you could go back to university and what they're learning in university and how much, there's more tech injected into the business curriculum and track that people are following. But as a software engineer, computer scientist, electrical engineer, there was no exposure to business and business concepts for me when I went through university. And I don't know how much that's changed. I was an adjunct professor a while back in the computer science department, and we certainly didn't have anything in our curriculum to introduce these concepts. But one big challenge is the technology is changing so incredibly fast. And when these new waves come, like everyone's talking about LLMs and Gen AI, and you're just inundated with it on LinkedIn and every form of technology media that you can get, it's what everyone is talking about. Understanding how it can really be applied to the business and understanding what the costs are in terms of leveraging it and what the privacy issues are really important. Getting people to be able to understand both simultaneously in today's day and age, I just think is a big challenge.
And following up on what you mentioned about generative AI, that is the topic of the moment. What are your thoughts on generative AI? Is it hype? Is it some hype? But how meaningful do you find it, the conversation that's currently taking place?
I mean, a lot of people say that this is like the next big revolution. And at Databricks, we subscribe to the importance of it for sure. I mean, we sort of cut our teeth as a data science company and trying to help organizations be more AI savvy. We recently did a acquisition of Mosaic ML, which is basically a company that provides the infrastructure for doing very low cost training on your own LLM models, which is really important for organizations that have a lot of sensitive information, sensitive data that they don't want to share out external to their organization, but they want to provide that ChatGPT-like functionality. I think it's going to show up in, two meaningful ways in the near term. Personally, I think it's going to show up in a lot of the vendor products that are content generating products. So take your Google Apps and your Microsoft Office type applications where, PowerPoint presentations can at least be notionally created for you and save you a bunch of work there. I think in terms of enterprises, you're going to be able to leverage it for more customer service and customer support type work. At Capital One, a very large percentage of the workforce was call center agents that just did the hard work of dealing with customers when there was a problem and trying to make sure that those customers were handled well and walk away happy. That type of environment, understanding like what's going on with that customer account and what's the sentiment analysis, all these things, like maybe generating what to say to the customer, these types of LLM style responses could be really beneficial for an enterprise.
And Doug, what's your perspective on generative AI?
I'm particularly enthused by it, especially because this is kind of the vision that we've all had in the AI industry since I was working at it in the late 80s, early 90s. And now finally we have the horsepower and the content and the ability to process all this data in unique ways. Obviously I'm initially very enthused about the ability for generative AI, as Chris mentioned, to generate content and code, but also perform analytics. I just had an analytics dialogue with one of the large language models to analyze some survey data that I generated. And having a half-hour conversation with it was like having a conversation with a data scientist. But I think beyond this, I'm much more excited about the possibilities of automating and integrating processes, even up through and including the possibility of what I and others call a self-driving organization, where we're able to use data and analytics and processes to automate almost everything that we do today, including creative processes.
Which I do think is really interesting. I mean, as a marketer, It's fascinating to me to think about content development and who does what and how do we think about highest and best use of people's time.
No, I do want to get back to something that Chris mentioned. I have a bit of a contrarian view on...
let's bring it, Doug Laney.
The requirements for data leaders to understand the business. I, in my experience, any experienced data professional can understand a business to a large degree by understanding what data is collected and generated and how it's used. And I also think any good data leader should be expected to bring new ideas. Most of the CDOs that I'm working with and helping to find new jobs or start up their data organizations are really encouraged by the leaders to bring new ideas from the industries that they came in. We're often asked as consultants, what are others in our industry doing? And my flippant response to that is, why do you want to be in second place? Why not borrow ideas from other industries and adapt them? So yes, it should be important for a data leader to understand the business. But I think just by looking at the data catalog, the architecture, you get a pretty good notion of how a business operates to a large degree by just looking at the data. Much like how detectives, follow the money, right? To understand, a crime. I think data professionals can follow the data to understand how a business operates to a large degree.
And Doug, just a quick follow-up question to that. As you have these conversations about setting up a data function or thinking about a data organization, how do you think about that? Or what advice do you have for those chief data officers?
Some of them are probably listening right now, so I better nail this.
Stick the landing, Doug Laney.
So I mentioned the maturity model that we use, and there's 8 different dimensions on it. So we need to accommodate each of those. It starts with a good vision that's well communicated and championed, how we're going to become a data-driven company, what a data-driven company looks like, what a data-driven culture looks like. I also think resourcing and skills is really, really important. We'll get to technology later, and having the resources and skills and the experience to be able to make that technology hum is important. A lot of organizations get stuck in kind of analysis paralysis and taking those baby steps, first maybe building the dashboards that help democratize data a little bit, and then moving toward more sophisticated analytics like diagnostic and predictive and prescriptive kinds of analytics, and then up into AI is important. But taking those steps, getting those wins is important. I also think a focus on innovation is critical. A lot of organizations really don't have a process for how to use data innovatively, how to monetize data, how to generate new offerings with it, how to generate new ways of working with customers or partners. And so I think a focus on innovation is critical as well.
And Doug, how do you work with clients on the selection of tools that are needed? It seems as though organizations have lots of data, but it's not necessarily actionable. Is that a fair generalization?
Just as with consulting services, I think looking for a technology provider that can be a true partner who can, as we say at West Monroe, meet you where you are and help you move forward is important. Too many technologies require too much of a do-over, starting from scratch or somewhere near that. We also recommend selecting technologies based on intended needs and uses, not a comparison of features and functions and which one has the most features in the longer feature list. That's just a ridiculous way to evaluate technologies. I also think, as I mentioned earlier, we need to be aware of available skills. So if you don't have those skills internally, ensure that they're readily available to support implementing whatever technology it is that you're going to choose. And I think Chris touched on this a little bit earlier. There's always this debate about adopting broad do-everything technologies that are both a dessert topping and a floor wax, as a shout out to an old Saturday Night Live bit. But piecing together the best of breed can be challenging. So if you're good at swapping out and integrating new technologies frequently, then the latter may work for you. If not, perhaps maybe index toward a more broader based technology platform.
And Chris, in your opinion, how many tech providers should companies use?
Well, I wouldn't say, to sort of follow up with what Doug said. To me, it's not the quantity, although we'll touch on that in a second. It is really the partnership and feeling like the vendor understands where you are today, where you are headed, can help with guiding that, and the enablement piece is really important. The enablement piece coming in the form of either training and or professional services, or with a strong partner network with the consultancies that can come in that are familiar with the individual tool or platform. In terms of the number, I just will, I'm sure the audience knows the ones that are having to deal with procurement and negotiations on licensing and things like that. For that to go well inside of an organization, especially a large enterprise, a lot of time from the technology teams has to be spent evaluating the tools, and from the end users understanding how to leverage the tool and get trained on it. So there's a big commitment from the organization's part in terms of time that goes beyond just the payment that's made for the license or whatever the agreement structure is. And so to me, fewer is better, frankly, because there are so many overlapping tools. And I think the number one thing an organization should do to get it right is to be crystal clear on what tool is used for what purpose within the organization. Because at the 50,000 foot level, so many of these technologies look and feel the same. And as Doug said, you don't want to get into this feature function matrix comparison because these tools leapfrog one another and they all sort of converge in the same direction. But when you get to the actual daily work of an end user, they need to know where they can go to discover the data. They need to know what they need to do in order to get access to the data if they don't have it already. They need to understand what use cases are good for a given tool or platform, and where those sort of lines, delineation lines, where they exist.
Yeah, we both started with the topic of partnership as being real critical, and I don't mind saying that our partnership with Databricks has really taken off, and I think it's based on appreciation of our clients working with Databricks and on how great they are to work with. So apologies for the infomercial, but thought I'd toss that in there.
Thank you, Doug. Chris, do you have some real life examples or some case studies that you could share with us about companies that have really gotten it right with their tech stack?
I mean, there's so, yeah, I mean, we've, again, I don't want to make this into an infomercial for Databricks, but AT&T, Disney, they come to mind for me, right? We as a company have worked with them closely from transition from on-prem to the cloud, various use cases that fall into the data engineering, data science, and data analytics domain. The data warehousing capabilities of our platform are now right up there on par with all of the major data warehousing providers. And so what we see and what we try to help organizations accomplish is do more with less, meaning rationalize down their data platforms, simplify the data estate, make it easier for people who show up to do work with data each day, understand where they need to go to perform a given capability or a task. And so that's really been the driving force. And we've got a lot of customers. I will say this, in terms of really kind of going at the data issue compared to like the hyperscalers and cloud native services. One of the things that we've seen, I mentioned it earlier, is most enterprises are already multi-cloud. And each of these major cloud providers, and we're great partners with each of the major cloud providers. And in fact, for Databricks, each of them, AWS, Google, and Microsoft, are all investors in Databricks. So they own an equity stake in the company. And I think the reason behind that was, A, they saw the early success of the platform, and B, they know that the success of our platform drives revenue on their end because of all the compute usage and things like that. But having said that, they each have their own data tools. And so if I'm the CDO or the CIO of an organization with 1,000 plus people, or even fewer than that necessarily, but a large number of people trying to work with data, and I know I'm already multi-cloud, I don't want to make the investment. I personally would not want to make the investment in teaching every person how to use the native tools in each of the cloud environments. It's just a huge cost and time sink. And it also is, just the amount of context switching that takes place. So our approach is a single user experience on top of any of those cloud environments. And it's one of the key reasons why I'm here.
What are some common challenges that organizations face when trying to integrate data from different sources?
Well, so again, I think when you're looking at a large enterprise, they've got data in lots of different sources, as I said earlier, sometimes up to like 1,000 different production systems. The data mesh movement, which says there's a producer and consumer model and that data products should be served up from the source systems. I start to layer in some reality with the tech stack associated with that, because most organizations don't want to go back and retrofit production systems to be dynamically scalable necessarily, or they're third-party systems that they don't have any control over. The big challenge of getting data in from these systems, there's lots of tooling that helps pull that data out. The question becomes, what do you do with it once you've extracted it from it? What's the periodicity? I like the fact that a lot of organizations are really looking at data from three lenses. The first is real-time data that's served up through streaming. You look at RESTful APIs and the sort of the microservices architecture where you can get fairly coarse-grained data out of a system in near real time. And then the final one is that bulk data that comes out that is served up for analytic purposes. So I'll pause there and see if Doug's got a reaction.
Doug, what's your reaction?
Again, I have a little contrarian
There's a
view
heavy side from our Doug.
about the data mesh. I'm a firm believer that data products should be designed by the consumers of the data, not by those who generate it. Especially if we're in a realm where we're democratizing data. I think the people who are producing data, who own the data sources, are not in any position to be able to, for the most part, conceive how other users will be using that data, what kinds of data products they need. Obviously, they'll be involved in that, but I don't think they should be the primary designers or developers of data products. I also think we have an issue with the concept of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
I know as part of every data governance initiative, we want to assign owners to data, and I think that's the worst idea we've ever come up with as a data profession. It's something that begets data silos and data hoarding. And as I started to look around at the ways that other assets are managed, when I was working on the Infonomics book, I came across in the world of financial services the concept of a trustee or a fiduciary, someone who is legally and ethically bound for the well-being and safekeeping of the asset, but that doesn't own it. So I think language matters a little bit here. And if we get away from that concept of, it's my data, I own it, then we're in a much better position culturally to be able to democratize data.
So it sounds like, Doug, you're saying that to have a data owner or ownership structure is at odds with data democratization. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's subtle. I think there should definitely be somebody who is responsible and accountable for a given data asset. But that term owner is something that carries a lot of baggage.
That's an interesting perspective. I like it. I was going to interject and say it sounds a little bit like we're just talking semantics, but I agree with you that the nuance of it is it actually matters, right? It's because it does permeate the culture of the organization. I was careful, I thought, to say producer and consumer. At Capital One, we created a self-service environment where somebody could go and produce what they thought was a data product. And they didn't necessarily have to be tied to the system that was viewed as the system of record. So I would agree with you in that sense. I do think, though, that we're not quite there yet in terms of organizations where you do need to protect the data in very sensitive, regulated industries. I come from the intelligence community and the financial services community. Opening up access to the full view of the data is a challenge, and I know you're not suggesting that, but the one thing to bridge the gap between where we are today and where you describe things is wanting to be, because I actually agree with you, is you measure the consumption of the things that are produced. Meaning, right now it's very easy for an organization to say whether or not they're using certain data because the majority of that data surfaces itself inside of a BI report. And you go to an organization, you see thousands of BI reports, and you wonder, do you really need all these damn things? But the next thing is, okay, if you're producing a data product out of a source system and it's flowing into your data platform, in your data ecosystem, can you measure whether or not that data actually gets consumed? And what's really interesting to me is, does that data get merged and combined with other data assets inside the organization? Because if it's always I'm a producer and I produce this piece of data and somebody runs a BI report against it, whoop-de-doo, who cares? That's not really moving the organization forward. But what if I'm creating a customer 360 view of data from 8 different source systems that we never had before? That to me becomes interesting. And can you measure whether or not that's being consumed?
Yeah, certainly utilization is a leading indicator of value, but one of the things we love to do for our clients is actually connect the data to its usage and the value that business function is creating. So we go a little bit further in trying to connect those dots.
Well, and Doug, we talk a lot about agility at West Monroe. And how does the tech stack contribute or not contribute to an organization's agility?
I find an organizational agility is really a function of how well people have data at their fingertips. And not just any data, but data that they trust and the same data that others that they know others have access to as well, and not data that's buried in spreadsheets, as we were just talking about. That said, increasingly, data and analytics output isn't consumed by humans. We talk a lot about the human experience with data democratization, but really, I think we should be thinking about applications as well and devices. The primary consumers of data and analytics increasingly are, if they're not already, devices and applications themselves. So agility is also a function of how well this integration is accomplished. Personally, like I said, I think we're on the cusp of what I call a self-driving organization in which data, technology, and processes are all tightly integrated by AI.
Delving a little bit more deeply into data democratization, I would be curious, what does data democratization mean to you? And I would love to hear from you both. And maybe, Chris, we start with you.
Well, I think it means the right data delivered to the right entity at the right time, and in a way where the entity doesn't have to go through a bunch of extra work in order to
Machinations.
get it.
Mhm.
Yeah, to get it or to leverage it, right? And so I use the word entity only because, to Doug's point, it could be a person, it could be a system, it doesn't matter. Again, I'm a software engineer. I layer in the software component of this as well, because having access to a piece of data, but maybe not the process that transform that data into something usable. I look at it from the raw ingest and having the data science community have access to the most raw version of the data so that they can do all the different experimenting so that they can figure out what they need out of that data set, to the most curated or refined data sets and everything that touches the data in between. So data democratization to me means having access to not just the data at any of those stages, but also the processes that operate on the data so that I can leverage the work that's been done by other teams and not recreate that work myself.
And Doug, what does data democratization mean to you?
Yeah, very, very much the same thing. I think there are two sides to that coin. Data democratization is probably a fancy misnomer for having people in the organization have the rights to and access to the data they need to do their jobs. A little bit nuance from what Chris said. It's not necessarily that the data is delivered, but that they actually have access to the data they need to do their job. And this is usually accomplished, as Chris was saying, but two sides of that same coin. First, the foundational architecture, like whether it's a data warehouse or data lake or data mesh, combined with the flip side, which is the self-service analytic tools and access. And those two together are really what enables data democratization.
Thank you. We've touched a little bit on silos. And I would be curious to get a little bit more into the weeds on that one with data silos that can hinder collaboration and insights. What strategies or what advice might you have for our listeners about how to break down those silos? Let's start with you, Chris.
Well, one, I think it gets back to what Doug was saying about making sure that the culture of the organization changes, where leaders do not feel like the systems that they are responsible for building and the data within those systems are their data or their systems, right? That it is the enterprise. And to start thinking about data more as a product and to collaborate across the different lines of business. We've seen organizations, multinational organizations, where you've got data sovereignty issues and data needs to reside in country. But insights from that data would benefit other parts of the organization that sit outside of that country. And so the collaboration and really getting somebody in there that can help facilitate the dialogue is really important. I mean, again, key thing number one is give up the ownership, this sort of mindset that this is my data, this is my system, you can't have it. Anything you want to know about the insights will generate, fund us to generate it from the system itself versus a more enterprise view. I think I've seen organizations where from the CEO and the board of directors, and I think you're seeing it more now with Gen AI, you're starting to see this, where they're saying, how do we actually leverage this in a way that we can increase revenue, decrease cost, decrease risk? These things are coming from top down. And I think that mantra, if it existed for just the data democratization and knocking out these silos, if that same sort of passion was there, I think you'd see this move more quickly.
And Doug, what's your advice to combating data silos?
Yeah, so I mentioned the topic of data owners, but kind of skipping over that, I think we're in a world where historically we've tightly thought about data and systems being tightly coupled. And that made sense maybe in the 80s and maybe a little bit in the 90s, but we're in a world today where data and systems ought to be decoupled. We ought to be managing technology and data separately. And then from a standpoint of vernacular, we shouldn't be talking about it as it's the SAP data or it's the Salesforce data. It's the data about inventory. It's the data about our customers or sales. And so we need to kind of change our language a little bit too within organizations to do that decoupling. At a macro level, I recommend that a core data strategy tenet, that data belongs to the organization, again, not to any individual department. And yes, there are going to be privacy and other sensitivity reasons about who gets to see what, employee salary data, for example. But I recommend starting with the mandate that data is an enterprise asset. And also that we ought to be measuring it and managing it the same way that we measure and manage our other physical and financial assets, irrespective that the accounting profession still hasn't come around to acknowledging data as an asset.
Well, and you and I've talked about that before, Doug, and I think it's such an interesting one when you think about, is it an asset on the balance sheet or, how might we be thinking about this differently? But I would suspect, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this, that data in a silo or that's being hoarded by a quote unquote owner is less valuable than an enterprise asset. Is that fair?
For sure. At least inside the organization, we should be making data available for broader purposes. We talked about previously data having these unique characteristics that it's a non-rival risk, non-depleting, progenitive asset. That is, that we can use it multiple ways simultaneously. When we do use it, it doesn't deplete. And that typically when we use data, it creates more data. So this really ought to compel organizations to think more broadly about how they're using data beyond just building pretty pie charts and dashing dashboards.
Going back to this idea of data democratization in different industry contexts, I know we've touched a little bit on financial services, Chris, given your background with Capital One, but are there some nuances by industry that influence the level of data democratization or the flow of data in companies? And I'd be curious to get your perspective. Maybe we start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think the only thing that really comes to mind from this question immediately is the speed at which the data and the use case need to execute, right? There are certain financial transactions that need to execute quickly, like a credit card authorization, approve or decline for a purchase, for example, or in manufacturing or telemetry data from, say, a self-driving car that needs to execute. So I encourage organizations to think about use cases from not only an SLA standpoint in terms of how fast does the use case need to execute in order to deliver value, it's really interesting. Like every organization, I've come across, there's someone that says like, well, ours is completely unique from everything else. And it's, well, why don't you bin things in sub-second response time, multi-second response time, and multi-minute response time? Start with that gross kind of binning of the SLA, like that service level agreement. How fast does it need to execute? And then the second thing is bin them in terms of whether or not this is an offensive use case or a defensive use case. And I generally encourage organizations to look at the list of defensive ones first, because these are the ones that either get you hacked or get your name, your organization's reputation on the front page of the newspaper. Lock those down first and then start looking at the offensive ones.
That's an outstanding framework, Chris.
Oh, well, it's mine.
Excellent.
So I'm meaning it's you can have it. I'm not saying it's mine and owned only by me, but it's what my little brain came up with.
No, it's great.
So thank you.
Yeah.
And Chris, Databricks is passionate about data democratization. What role has your company played in data democratization? And what do you see if you look into your crystal ball and look into the future, what role will you be playing?
Yeah, the crystal ball is an interesting way of framing it. Again, I've been here for 4 years. The company has been around for 10. And so a lot of credit, I think, goes to the founding group of engineers, and Ali Ghodsi, our CEO, of course, being one of them. The company made 3 big bets when they founded the company. And again, this is 10 years ago. So that context is important. They said, every company is going to be cloud. Every company is going to use open source, and every company is going to be an AI company. And saying that 10 years ago and using that as kind of the path that you set yourself out on. One, our product is cloud-based product. Our platform is cloud-based platform. It is predominantly built off of open source solutions. And we've been doing machine learning and AI stuff since, Spark came out.
That's quite a prescient vision.
Yeah. So, given where they were 10 years ago and sort of the predictions that they made, the things that the company is executing on now are just continuing down that trajectory. I've already mentioned the acquisition of Mosaic ML. We believe in a future where organizations that have tons of interesting and important and sensitive data are not going to want to ship their data to a third party to have a large language model built off of that. We want to provide an environment inside the Databricks platform that enables them to do that at a fraction of the cost. And I just think Databricks will continue to innovate on the open source underpinnings of the platform and really keep its focus on simplifying that user experience so that if you're a data engineer, a data scientist, or a data analyst, you can do one thing from one environment and be as productive as possible.
I'm going to shift now to the final 2 questions. Our next question is something that we like to ask of all of our guests on This is Digital. And the question is, what does digital mean to you? Chris, could we start with you?
Yeah, it is both exciting and scary to me. It's exciting because it means things that you used to have to wait on can happen instantaneously. You can call for a ride to get somewhere very quickly. You can transfer money between accounts at, your fingertips. I mean, it's just so many amazing things that you can do that you couldn't do. I mean, like I joke that I'm like halfway decent at my job just using my phone. And the things that you can accomplish with digital products is pretty amazing. The scary side of it is, the deep fakes, all this information coming from all these different sources, not having the bandwidth or the time or the wherewithal to figure out what information is accurate, what can you believe, what can you not believe. People are so easily influenced these days and pitted against one another, I think socially, especially in the United States, that my concern over digital is how much is it used to further divide people versus close the gap? And I don't see any entity that's really out there working to figure out how to close the gap. You see people trying to monetize things, and that monetization means generating sticky audiences that are going to want to consume that product. And so that's my fear.
Doug, what does digital mean to you?
So I see digital as the intersection of data, technology, and the human experience. It often involves automating or electronically streamlining a process, typically one that's highly manual, either by eliminating or reducing the need for human interaction. On the other hand, because of the streamlining, digital solutions can also offer customers more options and more ability to interact with your business than ever before. And of course, I share the same concerns that Chris has.
Well, and is there the potential for digital to connect and to bridge that divide that Chris, you were just describing? Hopefully is my perspective on that. The last question that I have for you both: if people would like to stay connected to what you're up to, what's the best platform for them to follow you? Chris, do you have a social media platform of choice?
I don't. You will likely see me more active on LinkedIn and posting some things there. There's a blog series at Databricks.com that I co-authored that talks about some executive sort of stepwise approach to data transformation and some of the lessons learned and things to look out for. Otherwise, you'll see me back here on your podcast, hopefully at some point.
Perfect. That sounds like a plan. Doug, how about you? What's the best place for people to stay connected to what you're up to?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn right now. I'm pretty active there, and anywhere I'm appearing or speaking at a conference or teaching, or if I post an article on Forbes or Chief Data Officer magazine, I'll also put it on LinkedIn. So that's a good single source. Most of the things I post, I'll use the hashtag Infonomics. So if you want to just follow that, then that's easy too.
Perfect. Well, Chris and Doug, thank you so much for joining this episode of This is Digital.
Thanks, Rissa. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Rissa.
Thanks for listening to This is Digital. If you enjoyed today's show, please follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a review. For more information on This is Digital, visit westmonroe.com/thisisdigital.